What if the British crown wasn't held up by duty, but by drugs? Behind the silk curtains and royal decrees lies a quieter truth. 25 royals who ruled not with iron wills, but with laudanum, morphine, and velvet-lined prescriptions. This isn't about scandal, it's about survival. Monarchs sedated through history, empires propped up by opium, and the question no coronation dares ask, how many of them were high the whole time? Before we dive in, if you're into dark royal secrets, foggy truths, and stories history textbooks quietly skip, hit that subscribe button. Helps the crown and the algorithm. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? Lunch break? Laudanum o'clock? Let's see who's out there drifting through this royal rabbit hole. 1. George IV, Prince Regent, later King. There's a special kind of delusion that only comes from decades of power, velvet, and uninterrupted access to laudanum. George IV, formerly the Prince Regent, wasn't so much ruling Britain as he was sedating his way through it. At any given time, he was either bloated with indulgence or barely conscious under the influence of a cocktail that included opiates, sedatives, brandy, and his own imagination. And yet, he styled himself as the most refined man in Europe. Taste, after all, is subjective. Doctors assigned to the Prince Regent kept a rotating schedule, not to treat his ailments, but to manage his dependence. They swapped his dosages like political alliances, constantly adjusting to prevent outright collapse. His preference: laudanum for the nerves, opium pills for the melancholy, and a healthy dose of brandy for breakfast. The walls of Carlton House may as well have sweated morphine. The public saw a grand figure in gold epaulets. What they didn't see was the slumped silhouette behind the curtains, whispering complaints about gout, indigestion, and the cruel weight of duty to whichever apothecary dared enter the room. By the time he finally became king, his body was in open rebellion, bloated, jaundiced, and high. His coronation was less a triumph and more of a chemically assisted photo op. And yet somehow he kept going, not ruling exactly, but floating, gliding through the fog of narcotics with the poise of a man who believed reality was simply an unfortunate rumor. Of course, he wasn't the only monarch to drift through rain and ruin in an opium haze. His spiritual twin, Queen Anne, took it a step further. She didn't just medicate the pain, she became the pain. 2. Queen Anne. If the crown weighed heavily on George IV, for Queen Anne it was more like a chronic, unrelenting migraine. And she treated it accordingly, daily, hourly, desperately, with laudanum, opium, and enough tinctures to make a physician weep. By the end of her reign, her medicine cabinet was more complete than the royal mint. Anne suffered from a body that betrayed her. 17 pregnancies, only one surviving child. Chronic gout, swollen joints, and a grief so deep it burrowed into her bones. She didn't rule England so much as endure it, dragging herself from bed to throne like a marionette in mourning. And through it all, the laudanum flowed. Contemporaries noted that she rarely appeared in public without visible signs of sedation. Slurred speech, vacant eyes, sudden naps mid-audience. She once nodded off during a parliamentary address, later explained as exhaustion, though those close to her knew better. Her dependence wasn't a secret, it was a quiet agreement. The Queen would keep functioning as long as the drugs kept coming. But the real mystery wasn't her use, it was her tolerance. Physicians doubled, tripled, quadrupled doses that would have leveled lesser nobles. Still, she pressed on. Perhaps it wasn't strength. Perhaps it was just inertia. The machinery of monarchy powered by morphine, dragging one woman's suffering across the entire British Empire. And if George IV dulled his ego with narcotics, Queen Anne did something darker. She dulled her heartbreak. Monarch by title, patient by necessity, ghost by choice. But not every royal had the privilege of secrecy. Some partied their way into history with their drug use and neon lights. Take Princess Margaret, for instance. She didn't hide it. She made it fashion. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not here for fairy tales. You're here for the stuff they leave out of the coronation footage. So go ahead, subscribe if you haven't already. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Middle of the night, morning commute, laudanum hour? Let's map the royal insomnia together. 3. Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon. There are two ways to fall apart in public: slowly, with discretion, or with pearls on, cigarette in hand, cocktail on the nightstand, and prescription pills rattling like castanets in your handbag. Princess Margaret chose the latter. The younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II was born into a world that expected perfection, but offered little in the way of purpose. Not quite royal enough to rule, not quite common enough to live freely, Margaret was stuck in the gilded purgatory of royal life, and she hated it. So she softened the edges, with champagne breakfasts, with Seconal for sleep, with painkillers for the migraines, with sedatives for the anxiety that came with being forever second. By the 1970s, friends spoke in careful euphemisms: delicate nerves, fatigue, lifestyle issues. But her medicine cabinet told a sharper story. There were barbiturates, benzodiazepines, codeine-laced analgesics, prescribed liberally, taken regularly. She once admitted she had a sensitive system, but the reality was less poetic. Margaret was drifting, more often horizontal than vertical, more often medicated than not. It wasn't scandalous, at least not by palace standards. What was scandalous was that she didn't pretend otherwise. She smoked in front of photographers. She drank in front of diplomats. She took pills because she felt bad, and didn't care who knew it. That, in royal circles, was the true rebellion. In the end, Margaret's story wasn't just about addiction. It was about a woman trapped between centuries, numbing herself into irrelevance. She didn't overdose, she evaporated. But not every royal had the grace, or the cover, of princesshood. Some were born into pressure cookers. Some were royal, yes, but also addicts, soldiers, outcasts, and casualties. Like the mysterious Prince George, Duke of Kent, whose love affair with morphine and cocaine was anything but discreet. 4. Prince George, Duke of Kent, son of George V. Prince George didn't just dabble. He indulged. And when it came to morphine and cocaine, he wasn't a cautionary tale. He was the protagonist. A royal by birth, a libertine by nature, George was the third son of King George V and Queen Mary. But unlike his more staid brothers, he was fascinated by the forbidden. The official version of George's life reads like a respectable resume: naval officer, RAF pilot, working royal. But underneath the stiff collars and ceremonial ribbons was a man in free fall, numbing boredom, war trauma, and internal chaos with the strongest substances available to an elite clientele. According to biographers and declassified files, George's dependence on morphine began after medical treatment and never quite stopped. Cocaine followed, then returned, then lingered in rumors and whispers long after his death. Some accounts speak of rehab attempts. Others speak of a small, loyal circle who helped keep it quiet. But the drugs were no secret among those who mattered. Not really. He died young, in a mysterious plane crash in 1942. Officially, it was a wartime accident. Unofficially, there were rumors of strange behavior, of a last-minute change in passenger list, of instability. Nothing confirmed, nothing denied, just enough ambiguity to make people wonder what really brought the prince down. The war, the crash, or the long, slow burn of addiction? Prince George's story feels different. It's not just about painkillers or stress or old age. It's about craving, about hiding, about running headlong into darkness, even with a crown in your blood. And still, he wasn't the only royal with a taste for sedation. His father, Edward VII, Bertie, was mixing laudanum with brandy before it was fashionable, or at least before it was clinical. 5. Edward VII, Albert Edward, Bertie. Edward VII was the kind of monarch who could make gluttony look dignified. Tailored suits, extravagant meals, mistresses by the dozen, and, just beneath the silk waistcoat, a quiet, steady relationship with laudanum. Bertie didn't inherit his mother's restraint. He inherited her nerves. And for that, his doctors had a Victorian cure-all: opium in syrup form, chloroform-laced sedatives, and whatever else dulled the roar in his chest. By the time he finally ascended the throne in 1901, after the world's longest apprenticeship in waiting, he was already on a first-name basis with his medicine bottles. Court physicians described him as prone to anxiety and heart strain. Translation: he couldn't breathe without a tincture or two. Laudanum soothed his digestion, chloroform mixtures helped him sleep, and the brandy. Well, the brandy was practically ceremonial by that point. But the most fascinating part? No one seemed especially alarmed. This was the age of socially acceptable drug dependency, as long as it came in a crystal bottle and not a syringe. Bertie wasn't disgraced. He was, somehow, more relatable. The overworked gentleman monarch, numbing his anxieties with 19th-century pharmaceuticals, puffing cigars in Paris, while the empire groaned under its own contradictions. He didn't spiral. He paced himself, right to the end. And when he died, it wasn't a scandal. It was a royal passing draped in tradition and morphine residue. But his son, George V, had a harder time hiding the cracks. If Edward sedated for leisure, George sedated for survival. His lungs betrayed him, his body revolted, and somewhere in between the injections and the duty, he became the first king in history to be eased into death on purpose, with morphine, by royal command. 6. George V. George V was a king made of duty, discipline, and tobacco-stained fingers. He didn't believe in sentiment, but he believed in routine. Tight schedules, strict uniforms, and a daily dosage of morphine-based medications to get him through the day. The empire was falling apart, but George kept calm and carried on, mostly thanks to the chemistry coursing through his veins. Chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and recurring lung infections turned the monarch into a medical project. Doctors tried everything: experimental sedatives, opiate derivatives, even cutting-edge German pharmaceuticals. And as the wars piled up and the colonies shrank, George shrank with them, wheezing behind palace walls, propped up by morphine and perseverance. His relationship with medication wasn't recreational, it was ritual. He used morphine the way other people used umbrellas. By the 1930s, it was clear he was in chronic decline. Coughing fits, sleepless nights, infections that never fully cleared. He wasn't ruling anymore, he was enduring. And then came the most unsettling detail in British royal medical history. On the night of his death in 1936, his physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine, not to relieve pain, but to ensure he died before midnight so his death could make the morning papers. It was mercy, perhaps, or vanity, or just schedule management. They called it euthanasia in whispers. But officially? A peaceful passing. George V's legacy was one of grim dignity, stiff upper lips, and silent suffering. His medical dependency was never called addiction, it was labeled treatment. A linguistic sedative for the truth, but his son, George VI, wouldn't be granted such narrative softness. For him, the drugs were less about exit strategy, and more about making it through the war, one morphine injection at a time. 7. George VI. George VI didn't want the crown. He didn't ask for the job, the pressure, or the spotlight. He certainly didn't ask for the war. But when his brother abdicated and the monarchy stumbled into crisis, George picked up the pieces and quietly fell apart behind the scenes. The king's public image was one of quiet resolve. He gave wartime speeches with a stammer that became symbolic. He visited bombed-out neighborhoods. He stood firm against fascism. But underneath the military coats and royal poise, George VI was in constant pain. Physical, psychological, and deeply private. The war years wrecked his body. Multiple surgeries, stomach ulcers, vascular problems, chronic stress that manifested as insomnia, chest pain, and shaking hands. His doctors responded the only way royal doctors knew how: morphine-based painkillers, sedatives for sleep, amphetamines for energy, then more sedatives for the come-down, a chemical pendulum swinging with royal precision. Biographers tiptoe around the word addiction, preferring gentler terms like dependency or therapeutic reliance. But court insiders knew the reality. Without his medication regimen, George couldn't function. His medical records show a man being medically propped up until there was barely a man left. By the end, George was a ghost in uniform, frail, exhausted, and heavily medicated. When he died in 1952, it wasn't sudden. It was a quiet surrender after years of chemically sustained duty. The nation mourned the king, but behind closed doors, doctors exhaled. The dosage wars were over, and then came Edward VIII, his older brother, the king who gave it all up for love, and in return got a lifetime supply of barbiturates, sedatives, and regret. 8. Edward VIII, later Duke of Windsor. Edward VIII was the only British monarch who ever quit. He didn't die on the throne. He didn't get dethroned. He just left, abdicated the crown for the woman he loved, and went into voluntary exile with a tailor-made wardrobe and a suitcase full of pharmaceuticals. After the scandal of 1936, Edward rebranded himself as a kind of royal outsider, cosmopolitan, unbothered, free. But behind the charm and photographs was a man increasingly reliant on chemical calm, barbiturates for sleep, sedatives for nerves, tranquilizers for that persistent sensation of historical irrelevance. He told friends he had trouble sleeping, that public life gave him headaches, that the strain of the crown still haunted him. Doctors prescribed accordingly, and then re-prescribed, and again. By the 1950s, he was reportedly taking multiple medications daily, many with cross-reactive effects. Wallace Simpson, ever the sharp-eyed consort, managed his dosages with the diligence of a private nurse, equal parts caretaker and co-conspirator. Unlike his brother George VI, Edward's dependency wasn't born from war or illness. It was existential. He had walked away from power and found himself trapped in a palace of irrelevance. Banished from history, still technically royal but functionally ornamental. He lived a long time, long enough to be forgotten, then remembered only as a romantic footnote with a complicated medical file. In the end, he died in Paris, surrounded by his things, portraits, medals, and a drawer full of sedatives. But if Edward used medication to fade from relevance, the Queen Mother used it to endure hers, quietly, politely, and with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. 9. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The Queen Mother was always smiling. In portraits, in parades, during bombings, funerals, scandals, always the smile. It was her armor, polished and unflinching. But behind the hats and pearls and impeccable posture was a woman being quietly sustained by a pharmacy's worth of prescribed comforts. Throughout her life, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the mother of two monarchs and the soft focus icon of mid-century Britishness, was reportedly reliant on a regular regimen of tranquilizers and sleep aids. Nothing dramatic, nothing salacious, just a steady flow of barbiturates, opiate-derived medications, and sedatives that kept the mask in place. Her public image was invincible, the Queen Mum who walked among the rubble after the Blitz, who told the press she couldn't possibly leave London because the children won't go without me, and I won't go without the king, and the king will never leave. Heroic, yes, but no one mentioned the doctors on call or the chemical scaffolding that made it all bearable. In later years, as her health declined and the palace grew quieter, her prescriptions multiplied. Insiders spoke in euphemisms: nerves, rest, doses adjusted. But the implication was clear. Elizabeth's iron constitution had its own chemical undercarriage. By the 1980s, some aides privately speculated that her dependency on certain opiate-based medications had long passed the point of necessity. And yet, she never unraveled. She endured, longer than almost anyone. 96 years of composure, of smiling, of surviving. But before her, another royal endured in less celebrated fashion. William IV, the so-called Sailor King, didn't wear elegance. He wore pain, and laudanum was his only loyal subject. 10. William IV, the Sailor King. William IV didn't have the polished air of his royal predecessors. He had the look of a man who'd been dragged backward through naval tradition, gout, and indigestion. Because he had. A career sailor before becoming king, William's body was a walking archive of injuries, inflammations, and long-ignored ailments. And like many of his era, he medicated it all the Victorian way, with laudanum. Gallons of it. Known as blunt, eccentric, and perpetually annoyed, William was less interested in the pageantry of kingship than in getting through the day without stabbing pain in his stomach or legs. Chronic digestive issues, likely ulcers, combined with debilitating nerve pain, left him in a near-constant state of discomfort. His solution wasn't complicated. Laudanum before breakfast, laudanum before state meetings, laudanum before bed. The dosage increased with his complaints. Medical records from his reign suggest a man whose prescriptions were more routine than ceremonial duties. Physicians kept detailed logs of treatment, an elegant euphemism for daily opiate administration. They knew he was hooked. He probably knew it too, but no one dared suggest cutting back. The king in pain was irritable. The king without laudanum? Unmanageable. There were days he barely functioned, drifting in and out of lucidity, while maintaining the bare minimum of royal responsibility. Parliament grumbled. Courtiers whispered. But William soldiered on, equal parts monarch and medical patient. And in his own haphazard way, he paved the way for another monarch who masked suffering beneath charm and flair. Charles II didn't self-medicate to survive. He did it because, frankly, he enjoyed it. 11. Charles II, the Merry Monarch. Charles II didn't just return the monarchy after the English Civil War. He resurrected decadence. Laughter, music, loose morals, and looser medicine cabinets. His court was a spectacle of excess, and Charles sat at the center, equal parts ringleader and patient. While others sought sobriety in Puritan ashes, he pursued pleasure through chemistry and alchemy and opium, lots of it. The Merry Monarch wasn't merely merry, he was frequently medicated. Like many in his age, Charles trusted in the booming trade of exotic tinctures and powdered remedies. Most of these were variations on a theme: opium, resins, fermented substances, and herbal extracts boiled into tonics promising everything from vitality to immortality. Apothecaries peddled their wares, and Charles, ever the curious skeptic, sampled them liberally. He had a deep interest in science and medicine, even founding the Royal Society. But in private, he used those same disciplines to experiment on himself. Tinctures from the East, mercury-laced concoctions, opium-based sleep mixtures. He believed in balancing the body's humors, mostly with narcotics and whatever sounded vaguely mystical. Charles suffered frequent headaches and digestive issues, often treated with opiates disguised as cordials. Court physicians noted his tolerance was impressive. Visitors noted his eyes sometimes looked glassy, and his moods could shift like weather. But none of it slowed him. If anything, it was all part of the performance. A king who laughed, drank, seduced, and swallowed whatever the age threw at him. He died abruptly at 54 after a sudden illness, having taken his usual drafts the night before. But the opium legacy didn't die with him, because centuries later, another king, one remembered more for his spine than his sins, may have leaned on the same dark comforts. Richard III didn't live long, but long enough to hurt. Long enough to reach for pain relief the medieval way. 12. Richard III. Richard III has been many things over the centuries. Villain, hunchback, usurper, Shakespeare's favorite punching bag. But strip away the myth and you're left with a man in his 30s, racked by physical pain and battlefield tension, trying to function in a body that twisted against him. A king not just fighting rivals, but his own skeleton. Modern forensic analysis of his recently uncovered remains confirmed what had long been rumored. Severe scoliosis, likely developed in adolescence and worsening with age. His spine curved in a way that would have caused chronic muscle strain, nerve compression, and persistent pain. And in a time before codeine or cortisone injections, there were few solutions, most of them either sharp, fermented, or laced with poppy. It's likely Richard used opium-based tinctures in the form of medieval sleeping draughts or potionals. These were herbal mixtures featuring poppy extracts, henbane, and alcohol, standard fare for pain management in 15th century medicine. He would have had access to royal physicians, monks, and traveling alchemists, all eager to mix up remedies to keep the monarch moving, or at least standing upright for a council meeting. There are no scandalous diaries or confessions of dependency, just strong circumstantial evidence, chronic spinal pain, repeated stress, access to the best medicines of his day, and a body that needed help just to survive the armor. Richard's reign was short, his defeat legendary. But before the battlefield brought him down, it was likely the weight of the crown, and his own twisted frame, that drove him toward the quiet, bitter seduction of narcotics. And speaking of bitterness, no royal drank the laudanum bottle dry quite like Caroline of Brunswick, a queen in title, a scandal in life, and a desperate case in any physician's ledger. 13. Caroline of Brunswick, Queen Caroline. Caroline of Brunswick wasn't just the wife of George IV, she was his public embarrassment, his private obsession, and perhaps the most drugged woman in England not residing in an asylum. Her marriage was a disaster from day one, a royal union marinated in mutual loathing. She fled court. He tried to divorce her. Parliament nearly combusted over the scandal. And through it all, Caroline clutched one thing with unwavering devotion: her laudanum bottle. The 19th century press painted her as eccentric, vulgar, possibly mad, but behind the caricature was a woman deeply isolated, relentlessly scrutinized, and, by every contemporary account, emotionally shattered. The remedy? Laudanum, opium's elegant cousin, prescribed for nerves, sleeplessness, indigestion, melancholy, and the general despair of being trapped in a royal mess. Her use wasn't hidden. Letters reference her doses, her drafts, her nervous condition. Physicians tried to manage it, but Caroline's reliance on narcotics was as constant as her scandals. During the infamous Queen Caroline affair, when George IV tried to have her legally excluded from the coronation, she was said to be almost entirely dependent on laudanum just to appear in public. This wasn't the poetic decline of a fragile queen. It was a spiraling dependence that mirrored the collapse of royal dignity itself. Caroline didn't fade. She clawed and shouted, and when that didn't work, she medicated, heavily. She died shortly after being denied entry to George's coronation. Some said it was heartbreak. Others pointed to laudanum toxicity. But really, it was just the end of a long, bitter prescription. And speaking of bitter men and bad marriages, Caroline's husband wasn't the only royal navigating illness with a bottle. Her brother-in-law by marriage, Prince George of Denmark, was fighting his own war, against gout, chronic illness, and a dependence that never quite made the history books. 14. Prince George of Denmark, consort of Queen Anne. Prince George of Denmark was, in most accounts, a quiet man, loyal, mild, forgettable, the kind of royal consort who rarely makes headlines and never starts a war. But beneath that docile exterior was a man ravaged by chronic illness, and quietly sustained by the most reliable Victorian painkiller of them all, laudanum. Married to Queen Anne, George shared in her misfortunes but rarely her spotlight. He fathered 17 children, none of whom survived to adulthood, and spent much of his life in the background, coughing. Gout was his most infamous tormentor, attacking his joints until he could barely walk. But there were whispers of other ailments: kidney disease, lingering fevers, and strange neurological symptoms that kept him bedridden for long stretches. Doctors prescribed accordingly. And in 17th century England, that meant laudanum. He used it daily, then obsessively. Accounts from court mention his erratic energy, sudden lethargy, and occasional disorientation, classic symptoms of long-term opiate use. But because he wasn't politically ambitious, no one seemed to mind. He was in pain. He took the medicine. And slowly, quietly, he faded into it. His death in 1708 was attributed to dropsy, an old-fashioned term for systemic failure. But those close to the court knew he had been declining for years. His last days were a haze of pain management and whispered prayers. No dramatics, just a steady decline, sweetened by opium and royal indifference. And as the Danish prince disappeared into medicated obscurity, his daughter-in-law in spirit, Queen Mary of Teck, would one day build a reputation for strength. But her strength came with its own secret recipe: opiates, sedatives, and the stubborn refusal to let anyone see her crack. 15. Queen Mary, Mary of Teck. Queen Mary of Teck had the spine of an institution. Stoic, immovable, and armored in Edwardian etiquette, she was the last of her kind, a queen consort who could look grief in the eye and not blink. But underneath the marble exterior was a body plagued by migraines, anxiety, and chronic insomnia. And for that, she had her own version of a crown, a bottle of tinctures, powders, and sedatives. Mary's public image was one of unshakable calm. She buried a son, endured a war, outlived a husband, watched her grandchildren redefine monarchy, and never once let her expression break beyond mild disapproval. But according to palace staff and private letters, her nerves were a different matter. Doctors regularly administered a cocktail of opiate-derived remedies, primarily for nervous unrest and sleeplessness. She was known to retreat for rest cures lasting days or weeks, code for periods of intense medication under medical supervision. Her preferred remedies included bromide-based sedatives, laudanum derivatives, and specialized sleeping drafts formulated by court physicians. All legal, all prescribed, all quietly dependency-forming. Even in her later years, Queen Mary maintained a regal schedule, but only with the assistance of ever-stronger medication. Those who visited her in private remarked on her slow speech, distant gaze, and perfectly timed silences. She never faltered in public. But in private, the scaffolding of her serenity was unmistakably chemical. And yet, she endured. She always endured. That was her power. But endurance came in many forms. Her son-in-law, Prince Philip, didn't numb his pain for presentation. He did it because life on the edge, naval, royal, or otherwise, comes with consequences. And some of them hurt long after the battles are over. 16. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Philip spent much of his life hiding in plain sight. Not in disguise, he just didn't need to be seen. The consort to a queen, a sailor-turned symbol, a man too modern for monarchy and too traditional to leave. He was blunt, fit, and always in motion. But the cost of all that movement, especially the early naval years, was a body that aged hard. And with that came the inevitable prescription pad. Philip's injuries were mostly out of sight, but quietly cumulative. Chronic back pain, joint issues, surgeries, and the kind of accumulated damage one collects over a lifetime of service, sports, and royal obligations. Unlike his wife, who lived on protocol and silence, Philip dealt with pain the old-fashioned way, He swallowed it, with help. By the 1990s, his health required regular interventions. Painkillers became part of the daily rhythm. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet march of opiate-based medication for nerve pain and inflammation. Insiders noted his growing reliance on prescriptions after hospital visits and surgeries. He joked about it, Philip always did, but there were times he vanished from public view for weeks. Recovery, they called it. Sedation, in reality. As he entered his final decades, it became routine, controlled pain management, tightly regulated, utterly necessary. Not addiction in the tabloid sense, just a life lived fast, catching up in slow, aching increments. And while Philip managed his pain like a duty, his brother-in-law, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, had no such luxury. For him, medication wasn't a tool, it was survival. Until it wasn't. 17. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, son of George V. Prince Henry was the middle son. Nobody quite knew what to do with. Not rebellious enough to make headlines, not charming enough to steal the spotlight, and never quite healthy enough to disappear from the royal radar. His life was marked by quiet duty and quieter decline. A man shaped by service, then undone by illness, and finally sustained by the steady drip of morphine-based treatment. From his early years, Prince Henry suffered from recurring respiratory infections. Pneumonia, pleurisy, and a revolving door of bronchial problems turned him into a permanent patient in a very public family. Over time, these conditions became chronic. His lungs never fully recovered, and neither did his strength. With every flare-up came the same medical solution: opiate-derived treatments to ease pain, suppress coughing fits, and allow him the basic dignity of breathing without distress. As the decades went on, his condition worsened, and so did his reliance. Doctors began speaking of his long-term management, a phrase that meant steady, controlled doses of morphine-based medication that kept his symptoms tolerable, but also left him increasingly dulled. He grew more withdrawn, less visible. By the time he suffered a major stroke in 1974, he was already a shadow of the vibrant sportsman he had once been. Henry's drug use never made headlines because it was never scandalous. It was clinical, quiet, and constant. A prince not undone by vice, but worn down by frailty and sustained by the strongest substances Victorian medicine never quite let go of. And yet, for all his retreat from the world, his niece, Victoria, Princess Royal, would face her own unraveling with more intensity, more pain, and far more desperate measures. Her decline wasn't whispered, it was witnessed. 18. Victoria, Princess Royal, German Empress, daughter of Queen Victoria. Victoria, Princess Royal, was born to be brilliant. The eldest daughter of Queen Victoria, she was multilingual by adolescence, politically astute by marriage, and tragically disillusioned by middle age. Married off to the future German emperor, she became Empress Friedrich for 99 days, and then slowly, a patient in her own palace, battling an illness that modern medicine could identify but not cure. And to endure it, she turned, like so many royals before her, to laudanum and morphine. Her health began to unravel in her 50s, when fatigue and pain overtook her energetic routines. At first, it was misdiagnosed as exhaustion, then female hysteria, then a collection of vague complaints. Eventually, the truth arrived with cruel clarity: cancer. Painful, debilitating, and resistant to every Victorian treatment not soaked in opium. Victoria's letters from this period shift in tone, sharp observations replaced by fragmented thoughts, gratitude replaced by numb resignation. She wrote of the bitter taste of her medicines, the clouded hours, and how difficult it was to distinguish sleep from forgetfulness. Morphine became her anchor, laudanum followed. Toward the end, her caretakers alternated injections with oral doses just to keep her stable enough to receive visitors. But what haunts most is her awareness. Unlike so many sedated royals, Victoria remained intellectually alert for much of her decline. She knew what was happening. She understood the cost. And still, She asked for the next dose. Pain may have stolen her power, but opiates took the memory of it. Her sister Alice wouldn't be so lucky. Grief took her first, drugs later, and together they formed a tragic duet in the royal ledger of dependencies. 19. Princess Alice, daughter of Queen Victoria. Princess Alice was Queen Victoria's second daughter and perhaps her most emotionally transparent child. A rarity in a family built on repression. Sensitive, dutiful, and relentlessly empathetic, Alice carried the emotional weight of her siblings, her own children, and eventually, the grief that would all but consume her. Her solace? Laudanum. A lot of it. After marrying Louis of Hesse and relocating to the German court, Alice's life quickly descended into a relentless cycle of childbirth, caregiving, and crisis. She lost a son to hemophilia-related injuries. She then lost a daughter to diphtheria. And through it all, she remained the family nurse, the one who bathed the sick, comforted the dying, and tried to hold her household together by force of will. But willpower can only go so far. Her letters to her mother reveal a woman in slow collapse, plagued by insomnia, nerve pain, and what would now be recognized as clinical depression. Victorian medicine offered her the standard cure, laudanum, a poppy-based tincture that dulled the edges and blurred the grief. Alice used it regularly and without apology. She called it the only thing that brings rest. She wasn't addicted in the dramatic, ruinous sense. She was dependent in the quiet, exhausted way so many women of her era were. A respectable mother and princess, outwardly composed, but sedated into stillness behind closed doors. When she died at the age of 35, it was diphtheria that claimed her. But the slow fading, the emotional erosion, that came first. And just as Alice faded, her mother rose. Queen Victoria, the woman who buried 9 children and ruled an empire, would carry her own stash of grief and morphine with her to the grave. But she didn't just rely on laudanum, she turned cannabis into protocol. 20. Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria, the grand matriarch of the 19th century, ruled over an empire on which the sun never set, and did so under the influence of opiates and cannabis for most of her adult life. Not in excess, not in scandal, but with the methodical regularity of someone who understood that emotional endurance required pharmaceutical assistance. The official portraits show her as iron-willed, unsmiling, and draped in black. But privately, Victoria was riddled with ailments. Menstrual pain, migraines, neuralgia, insomnia, and a grief so enduring it became a second skin. After the death of Prince Albert, her lifelong dependence on laudanum, already habitual, deepened. Doctors prescribed morphine-based remedies for her nervous excitability and feminine disorders. She took them all. But Victoria was also a woman of her time, and she embraced Victorian-era medicinal experimentation. One of her physicians, Sir J. Russell Reynolds, famously prescribed her cannabis tinctures, yes, actual marijuana, to ease her menstrual cramps and insomnia. She approved, enthusiastically. She reportedly described the tincture as delightful in its effects. None of this was considered taboo. The 19th century British medical establishment practically encouraged such treatments. But what makes Victoria's case compelling is how seamlessly it became part of her daily life. She didn't retreat from duty, she incorporated her vices into it. A mourning widow, a ruling empress, and a woman silently numbed by the best pharmacology her empire could provide. Her body, like her crown, was propped up by empire, and by poppy and plant. But while Victoria medicated her sorrow in private, her youngest son, Prince Leopold, had no such choice. His pain was constant, his condition incurable, and his reliance on narcotics not just habitual, inevitable. 21. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. Prince Leopold was born under a sentence. The youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, he entered the world with a royal title and a chronic illness, hemophilia. In a time when a scraped knee could turn into a death sentence, Leopold's life was one of permanent caution, relentless supervision, and unrelenting pain. He was bright, artistic, intellectually curious, everything a royal son should be, except durable. His condition made even the simplest activities dangerous. Walking too much? Risk. A fall. Potentially fatal. The result was a life indoors, confined not just by illness but by the very real fear of it. And as the pain increased with age, especially in his joints where internal bleeding caused constant inflammation, so did the need for relief. Enter morphine. Doctors prescribed it liberally, not because they were careless, but because they were helpless. There was no cure, there was no management strategy, there was only pain and the attempt to blunt it. Leopold was treated with strong opiate-based medications from adolescence onward. Laudanum, morphine injections, and poppy-based pills became his daily regimen. What separates his story from so many others is that his dependency wasn't hidden. It wasn't even considered improper. Everyone knew the prince was suffering, and no one begrudged him the chemicals that kept him functional. But even those had limits. In 1884, at the age of just 30, Leopold slipped and fell while visiting France. The injury triggered a cerebral hemorrhage. He died shortly after. Pain had shadowed his life, and narcotics had kept it barely livable. But in the end, his body gave out, long before his will did. His sister, Princess Louise, fared better in years, but not necessarily in clarity. For Louise, art, rebellion, and whispered indulgences mixed together into something that smelled faintly of poppy and paint. 22. Princess Louise, Duchess of Argyll, daughter of Queen Victoria. Princess Louise was never satisfied with the role she was given. As Queen Victoria's most independent and artistically inclined daughter, she chafed against the expectations of royal womanhood with a particular venom. She sculpted, she traveled alone, she argued, and if the rumors are to be believed, she dabbled, specifically in opiates and cannabis-laced creativity tonics, favored by the bohemian set of the late Victorian era. Louise was immersed in artistic circles, socializing with poets, painters, and progressive thinkers who didn't just wear black, they experimented with the mind. It's within these circles that whispers began to emerge, that the princess enjoyed enhanced states of inspiration, reportedly aided by the tinctures and elixirs popular among artists of the day. These weren't the heavy morphine regimens of her siblings. They were subtler. Essence of Indian hemp, dreaming powders, ether tonics. The kind of things that didn't raise alarms, unless you knew what they were made of. Nothing was ever confirmed, no scandal ever broke, but letters from friends and memoirs published long after her death hint at a woman who sought escape, not from pain, but from boredom. Her marriage to the Duke of Argyll was strained, and her role in court life was often ceremonial at best. So she turned inward, and occasionally upward, into altered headspaces that gave her relief from royal repetition. Louise lived a long, complicated life. She wasn't destroyed by her rumored habits, but she wasn't untouched by them either. And then there was her aunt, Princess Theodora of Leiningen, who didn't seek escape in art or rebellion, just in silence, solitude, and the slow, steady hush of laudanum. 23. Princess Theodora of Leiningen, Queen Victoria's half-sister. Princess Theodora of Leiningen lived in the footnotes of history. She was Queen Victoria's elder half-sister, born from their mother's first marriage and quietly exiled to the outskirts of royal drama. Unlike Victoria, she didn't rule. She didn't rebel. She simply endured. And for that, she became one of the most quietly medicated women in 19th century royal Europe. Theodora's life was a long, slow march through chronic illness, repetitive pregnancies, and emotional wear that never quite healed. Letters between her and Victoria reveal a woman caught in endless cycles of exhaustion. She suffered from what Victorian physicians called female weaknesses, A sweeping diagnosis that included endometriosis, neuralgia, anxiety, and likely postpartum depression. The prescribed cure was always the same: laudanum, soothing, silent, socially acceptable. She took it regularly, sometimes daily. What began as a medical aid became a coping mechanism. Pain, both physical and emotional, was a recurring theme in her correspondence. She rarely complained directly, but the subtext was clear. Theodora was fading, not in scandal, not in disgrace, just slowly, imperceptibly, under a fog of chemical relief. Unlike her more infamous relatives, Theodora left no scandals, no public crises. Just a trail of quietly administered dosages, and a legacy of sisterly letters soaked in sadness. Her life was defined by distance, from power, from health, from clarity. And yet, even Theodora's sedation had context. Because the woman who came before her, Mary, Queen of Scots, wasn't just medicated. She was caged, and the opium she was given wasn't for luxury or nerves, it was for survival. 24. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, has been cast in many roles: the tragic romantic, the political pawn, the Catholic martyr. But rarely is she portrayed as what she also became in her final years: a woman likely dependent on opium-based sedatives just to remain coherent while history slowly crushed her underfoot. From the moment she returned to Scotland, Mary's life became a spiral of betrayal, imprisonment, and calculated manipulation. She lost her crown, her freedom, and eventually even the right to her own pain. Her years in captivity under Elizabeth I weren't simply about waiting, they were about deteriorating. She was confined, surveilled, isolated, and she was sick. Reports from her custodians mention long bouts of illness: stomach pain, headaches, chronic fatigue, depression. Physicians attending her prescribed the standard remedies of the late 16th century: tinctures made with poppy, powdered opiates mixed into wine, herbal draughts designed more for quiet than for cure. Mary reportedly became reliant on these concoctions to sleep, to eat, to exist within the shrinking walls of her cell. She never confessed dependency, not in words. But her letters changed. They grew slower, sloppier, more emotionally erratic. Her caretakers noted long sleeps and disordered thoughts, especially in her final months. When she was finally executed in 1587, her physical body was already worn down by years of stress and subtle sedation. The legend ends with a sword, but before the blade, there was a bottle, and generations later, another monarch, this time a king, would spend his final decades almost entirely propped up by similar potions. Henry VIII didn't go quietly, and he certainly didn't go clean. 25. Henry VIII. Henry VIII didn't have a drug problem. He had a pain problem, and then a power problem, and then a pain problem again, with far fewer horses and mistresses to distract him from it. In his younger years, he was a golden monarch, athletic, brilliant, vain. But by his 40s, he was swollen, angry, and chronically ill. By his 50s, he was barely walking, barely sleeping, and barely functioning without the help of increasingly powerful medicinal brews. His infamous leg ulcers weren't just grotesque, they were agonizing. The open wounds refused to heal, likely due to type 2 diabetes and circulatory failure. With every step came pain. With every failed remedy came another dose of medieval narcotics. Royal physicians applied poultices and brewed elixirs laced with poppy, mandrake, and various distilled sedatives. He was likely taking opium-based concoctions multiple times a day by the end. Court records note drafts for rest, syrups for inflammation, and night tinctures for the king's serenity. All of it code for the same thing: a monarch medicated into compliance. His moods grew erratic, his appetite uncontrollable, his temper legendary. The pain didn't just reshape his body. It warped his court, his politics, and his perception of loyalty. By the time he died in 1547, Henry was no longer the golden prince of his youth. He was a deeply medicated, profoundly unstable man ruling through rage and narcotic fog. His body had collapsed, but his rule endured, chemically extended, artificially soothed. And thus ended the long royal line of dependency, stretching from Tudor to Windsor, wrapped not just in ermine and jewels, but in morphine, laudanum, cannabis, and the quiet desperation of numbed pain.